saying tonight, getting started this morning. And we left off with nihilism and pretty much finished looking at that. Nihilism is basically the belief of nothingness, that nothing exists in reality. Everything is an illusion. And of course, we know that that just does not match up to our reality. There is a reality. We all know there is reality, and they know there's a reality too if you drive them to certain points. If you question them, if you were to force them in certain situations, they would say, yes, there is reality. There is difference between poison and what I'm drinking water, and it does cause consequences. So life is very real, and the Bible's very clear about that as well. God gave existence, reality to this world. We all have a reality, and we have a real eternity that we're facing as well. Not just the here and now, not just a real here and now, but a real and coming future that we all must face. And we closed out with a couple of verses, but John 3:19 says, "This is the condemnation, that light has come into the world, and men love darkness rather than light, because their deeds were evil." And that is the reason why we have these false beliefs, these false worldviews, is because men love darkness rather than light. They want to reject God. And I got to thinking this morning as I was finishing up some studying for what we're going to look at today, each of these is a response to the other. And it's kind of like they try to fix one thing and ends up causing this, and try to fix one thing and ends up causing this. If you ever been working on a project or maybe something you've been trying to square and level up, and sometimes you're not careful, you try and level up this side and it unlevels this side, and you keep going back and forth, and it does not get level. And that's where all these different worldviews that we've looked at over the past few weeks, the main reason they're off kilter is because they rejected God. And without putting God back in there, they're never going to get it right. It's always going to be off. And so God is so important to our worldview. And each time they try to find or discover or believe a worldview that rejects God, try to assume a belief that does not include God, it results in something else going off balance, which results in maybe a generation or two later saying, no, because this was wrong, we invent this belief and so forth. And so that's where we come to existentialism. It's really a response to nihilism. Nihilism, we talked last week how it began in 1860s over in Russia, and then it kind of spread over the world. And so then we move on, and existentialism, which we're going to look at today, as a response to that. Existentialism began in the 1930s. Though nihilism and naturalism are still alive at that time, they're still well alive today, those beliefs. But existentialism is really a response to different philosophers, I guess is the better way to put it, trying to come up with an answer to unsolved questions. Hey, Jacob, would you just slightly turn down the gain there? I'm getting a little feedback, and for some reason it puts this little thing in my ear. I don't know, it bothers a little bit, but that's much better. Appreciate that. And but existentialism. So it's a response to nihilism. So nihilism gives no meaning to life. There's no purpose. There's no intention. And so existentialism says we've got to find some reason to give purpose and meaning to life. So it's just back and forth. Naturalism says get rid of God. Meaning comes to what I do. And then nihilism comes along and says no, there is no meaning to anything. And then now it's just fluctuating back and forth, riding the waves. And so when we come to existentialism, we ask, well, what does it mean? And really, it's an endless search to find meaning in life. Of course, finding meaning in life unhindered by presuppositions, this is their belief, or apart from the influence of other beliefs. They want to find meaning apart from other pre-held beliefs, any other pre-held religion. And it is called a find yourself philosophy. We're going to get to it in a moment, but there's two types of existentialism. There is theistic, which believes in God. We'll find out what that means. And then there's atheistic, which rejects God. It began atheistically, and then eventually theistic or theism. Philosophers picked up on it and began incorporating into biblical beliefs, which of course became false beliefs. So it's a find yourself philosophy. You need to go out. You've heard it, the phrase probably, go find yourself. And so the goal is, in this belief, to go beyond nihilism, transcend nothingness, and find meaning, find substance, find something with solid meaning, I guess is the way to put it. And it's really a parasite, some would say, on naturalism and theism. It really attacks and degrades both of those beliefs. When you try to be a theistic existentialist or a theistic nihilist, naturalist, whatever you want to call it, it pulls apart those beliefs. But all of these beliefs, all that we've looked up besides theism, that we've talked about, biblical theism, really it's about trying to find significance in an insignificant world. At least in their minds. I realize this world is significant. God gave it significance. But the removal of God, that they've removed God, any thought of God, so their world becomes insignificant. So they're trying to find significance in everything else but God, the one who gave this world significance. And one author wrote, the therapeutic value of existential analysis permits, on the one hand, the liberating of human existence from beguilements or debasements to which its subject, that's us, in daily life, and on the other, directing human existence toward authenticity, or, i.e., toward a relationship that is well-grounded on itself and with other humans, with the world, or with God. And so they're trying to find themselves, get rid of all what they would say debasements or anything that would hinder us from finding our true selves. Any other beliefs that are existing, Islam, for some atheistic existentialists, Christianity would be one. But they want to remove all other influences. That's where you get the God is dead theory. They want to remove the belief of God, the mention of God, and all of that. They want to kill God, the belief. They consider God to be just a mental thought, not a person who actually exists. And so that's where you get the God is dead thought. And when they want to find meaning in life, they want to find themselves, is the term they use. They want to remove all other influences and discover themselves. And so that's where this belief comes out of. Now, there was a lady who was very influential, Marie Main de Brand, and I don't know exactly who she is, but she apparently was very influential in this belief. But she wrote this: even from infancy, I remember that I marveled at the sense of my existence. I was already led by instinct to, notice here, look within myself in order to know how it is possible that I could live, that I could be alive and be myself. So looking within myself, trying to find life and meaning and purpose, basically find reality. So they're nihilists in a lot of beliefs. Nihilist, naturalist, depends on which side of the river they float, but they're trying to find themselves within themselves. And in other words, I'm going to discover some sort of utopia, discover some sort of mental peace, discover some sort of true meaning and purpose to life. Discover themselves. Now, there's a famous author, you may have heard of him, Soren Kirkegaard, and I'm not too familiar with him, but he is credited with being one of the first philosophers for this false worldview. But he says this, that each individual, not society or religion, is solely responsible for giving meaning to life and living it passionately and sincerely, or they like their term, authentically. So they want to live authentically. They want to live it a real life, the true life. And in fact, sometimes you'll hear someone say, it's used in commercials actually a lot, live your best life or live your good life. They'll say, if you buy this, you'll be living the good life or living the best life. And that's kind of a phrase that takes its root somewhat in here and this belief. But finding the best, finding your purpose and meaning. And another author wrote, the greatest asset of existentialism, in my opinion, is its central concept of existence precedes essence. In other words, individual humans can shape their existence and do not require an external agency or preconceived notions to give their life its essence. In other words, I don't need to believe anything else to give my life existence. I don't need to believe in a God. I don't need to believe in some sort of karma or anything else to find existence. The existentialist worldview gives the individual the freedom, he's saying this is why it's so good, the freedom to create their meaning and design the morality instead of someone else spelling what needs to be done out for them. In my opinion, such a worldview is genuinely liberating. That's actually from the Korea Times, a large newspaper over there. But so it's liberating to be able to find yourself apart from the influence. And here's where a lot of this younger generation wants to get rid of, again, tying it with nihilism, the existing laws in lands and countries, overthrow the governments, and somewhat, if you might kind of catch those tones of communism in that, socialism, overthrowing the current governments and establishing a new where everyone determines morality, or individuals would determine morality. What's right in my eyes, of course, that ends up falling under whoever you might say emperor, or I don't know what the president over all that dictates everything. He ends up determining what is right and what is wrong usually. And the same author on that article continued, existentialism is, again, quite liberating in this sense, as there is profound positivity in knowing that your actions give your life meanings, not any a priori, that meaning anything prior, anything transcendent before you, a magical deity or dimensionless being. He's really attacking God there. Any a priori magical deity or dimensionless being. Again, there's hope for everyone as they hold the key to their own quality of life by taking the right actions and doing the right things. The Eastern concept of karma seems to be channeling the same essence. In other words, I take the right action, it's going to give me the right response, I'm going to feel good. And so we'll get to how all this blends in a moment. But another author commenting on this wrote, humans are therefore called being, because they are defined by the fact that they exist or are in a world and inhabited. In other words, we're just being, we're not really existing. Existentialism. And let me see here. I don't want to jump ahead too much. But one other author commented, I just read these authors because it probably gives you a better idea than I could explain of what this existentialists believe. But existence is constituted by possibilities, from among which the individual may choose and through which he can project himself. So basically they're saying there's all these possibilities in life. You choose one and you find yourself in that and project yourself. Let's see here. Well, I'll end with that. But I think you kind of get the idea that existentialists simply want to discover themselves through some sort of channel. That apart from God, apart from any other prior or established influence, and find ourselves in something new, something to give me meaning that isn't already established before me. Now, as I mentioned before, there's two kinds of existentialism. There's atheistic existentialism, and then there is theistic. And interesting, the theistic existentialism is quite weird, but there are those that believe it, and we'll get to more of that later on. But let me just briefly describe both these to you, and then I'll look at atheistic existentialism. But for the atheistic existentialists, they would say matter exists eternally. In other words, kind of going along the naturalist line, that matter has always been. God does not exist. And again, we've seen that pattern with the past three worldviews we looked at. God does not exist. And the world is a closed system of cause and effect. And again, that's been consistent through all these beliefs, is that the world cannot, if you have no God, then why would there be any outside influence, any exterior influence or transcendent influence on the world? It's a closed system. It's limited to just itself. There is no outside or exterior influence. And then they would say there is no purpose to history, and morality and ethics is only relative to human beings. In fact, that's how they find themselves. Part of it is finding good, finding the good within yourself. So there's no purpose to history. And morality and ethics is only relative to human beings. We'll come back to that in a moment. But there's theistic existentialism. And I'll just briefly summarize that. It said they believe that we are personal beings, and that when we come to full consciousness, or in other words, find ourselves in a universe, and we find out whether or not God exists, is solved by faith, not reason. So, in other words, I don't come to reasonable conclusions that there is a God. I got to take what they call is a leap of faith. It is a matter of finding yourself when you come to self-awareness. They believe that you must take, and again, I just mentioned this leap of faith and believe, and when you do, then these truths about creation, existence, and others flow in. So in other words, they wouldn't say we go to the Word of God necessarily to find how we came to be, creation and so forth. They would say you take this leap of faith, you don't actually believe the Bible, you take this leap of faith, and it's kind of crazy. Well, we believe in faith, you would say. Not the same faith they're talking about. It's really a twist on words. But this leap of faith, in other words, I gotta believe and believe and believe until finally, bang, I grasp it, and I find myself in the Scriptures, and I find myself in God. We'll talk more about that when we get there. But they would say these things, before you take this leap of faith, knowing about creation and God and so forth, could not be known until you found yourself. And you find yourself by taking this giant leap of faith, and we'll talk more about that. It's contrary to the Scriptures, obviously, and to me, it's quite silly. But anyways, back to atheistic existentialism. And I'm not going to go, I've been going through these beliefs, answering 7 questions, prime reality and so forth. I'm not going to do that because we've already talked about naturalism, nihilism, and they basically reject God. So primary reality or ultimate reality does not exist. There's no first cause or anything like that. What is a human being? And that's where this comes in. It mainly centers around the human being. The other aspects are the same as any of the other 2 beliefs we studied prior. But so basically it rests on what is a human being. Now, they would say that there's 2 states of being. Now, what do you say by being? There's a human being, an individual, but there's also this idea of being or existing. They would say we are, we exist, we're being. They say there's 2 states of being. They separate, we believe we're just here. We're being, we're existing. We're existing in this world. One day we'll exist eternally forever in the world to come. But they would split where we are presently into 2 different states of being. Now, I know it sounds crazy, but this is what they believe. And the first being, the first existing, is the objective world. The objective world would be this world that we live in. So the objective world would be creation. It'd be matter, all those sort of things. My body would be the objective world. That's the first state of being. The subjective world would be my consciousness, my awareness, my knowledge. That's a different world to them, a different state of being. And the first objective world, eventually through, of course, evolutionistic processes, matter evolving, eventually kicked out the other being. In other words, you have this matter being. Hey, we existed as monkeys before, and eventually we developed or became this world kicked out or created this separate world, this separate idea of being, this separate existence, also known as consciousness. And so this world, the objective world in their mind, is the world of material. And of course it includes physical matter, the physical matter of human beings. My hands and my body is the objective world. That's the first state of being. Again, I point to the fact that the Bible is very clear. We're in one state of being. We're here and existing. There's no distinction. I'm existing as a mind and a brain. I'm existing as... now, that doesn't say we don't believe in a soul and a spirit, but those exist right here with me in the same body right now. And one day, the immaterial being will go back to heaven, and this material being will then be separated. Right now, they're joined together, my immaterial with my material being. And they would, of course, tie in the human body, and everything is tied into matter to this world. Whereas I would say, no, I'm separate and distinct from this world. I'm not part of the earth. In the sense now, I'm obviously a human being on the earth. I'm not what the Bible calls a celestial being, that's for sure. I'm part of this world system. But I'm not the actual earth. I'm not just another part of matter. No, I'm a created being by God. And so they make this distinction. This world and matter exist, and then this consciousness, knowledge exists in a whole other separate world. And so now, well, let me not jump ahead. Science, they would say, is a process by which we can know the world, though it has always so existed in some form. So you have this 2 states of being. You have the world, and then you have knowledge. Now, they would say knowledge of facts, for instance, gravity and all the physics, science, and all those sort of things are part of the world. They're material matter. Those things are strictly laws and orders created by the world, but they're going to separate the laws of science and scientific things, math, and so forth. They're going to separate that from consciousness and probably another term would be rationality, maybe. They would separate. They say that's part of the world. We want to discover this other part. We want to discover this subjective part over here. We want to discover consciousness and so forth. And so you're going to see that separated as we look along. And then, as I mentioned, so the first state of being is the objective world, material matter. The second state of being is the subjective world, that of the mind, consciousness, awareness. And you say, what do they mean by subjectivity? In other words, existing in one's mind. That's what subjectivity means in this instance. Usually we would say something subject to something. I'm under the influence of something. But in their idea, subjectivity is existing in one's mind. And so subjectivity, they would say, existing in one's mind is the self's, beings. These are all hard terms to understand, I think. wow, I need to make this clear for you guys. In other words, they're taking the not self, my material body, and making self out of that. They're going to say, my material body, self is existing here, but I'm going to find my not self, my not yet existing part. Go ahead, Brother David.
I have a hard time wrapping my brain. So, would a good visual be, they sort of kind of believe like there's a shadow world where everything, we have the physical world, and then there's the shadow world that is sort of like overlaying or right next to the physical world, and it's kind of...
So, close, but not so, because that shadow world you find, you create, you discover. So it's not yet existing. You're going to create that existence and give existence to that shadowy world of consciousness, awareness, and so forth. And so, yes, they believe in this world, but they also believe in almost discovering this other world, this consciousness, state of being, as we would know, state of being. For instance, knowledge. They would say knowledge is not like pouring liquid in a bottle, but as an organism takes in food. So what do they mean by that? That's a quote from one of them. Knowledge, they would say, knowledge is not something I receive, I pour into myself. Knowledge is rather something I partake of, I basically eat or grasp and learn, and that begins to create knowledge. I might read a book, but that learning begins to become a part. In other words, I begin to be able to understand. I begin to be able to know. I'm not created to know, like we would say God created you and I with the ability, capacity to know. They would say I begin to discover myself within myself. I just discover my consciousness. I might read a book and realize, oh, there's governments, and I begin to discover myself and the world around me. And so they would say this other world becomes reality as I begin to partake of these certain things. And that gives existence to my world. That's where they're trying to find meaning. Life, trying to find yourself, is looking within yourself. You might read a book and you begin to understand and discover, and you're creating your other self over here. You have yourself here in physical matter, and then you're creating this self-person over here of immaterial matter.
So that's their ultimate goal?
It's, yes, to find yourself, to be able to transcend reality and find yourself in this non-existent world, not a physical world, but in this I guess imaginary world is the best way to put it. But
to define my imaginary person.
Right, yeah. And so there are, most of the time we meet these folks and we say, well, you're crazy, is usually what our response is. But there are folks that believe it, and that was the response to nihilism and all that followed after this belief as well. And they would say simply, knowledge turns into the knower. Maybe that's another phrase to kind of grasp that. So knowledge, as I began to develop knowledge, I then become a knower. I then begin to exist, finding myself. I find myself by maybe learning some things. I find myself by discovering some things. And so that's their belief. And here's another thing. You become what you think you are. You have to find yourself. That's a phrase that we'll sometimes say. You become what you think you are. And that's true. What the Bible tells us, out of the heart are the issues of life. But we already exist as an immaterial being. God, the moment we were at conception, we were given life. That immaterial being and the material being was given existence all at once. It's not two separate realities. It's there at once. And they would say we're going to create this. We're going to discover this immaterial part of us. And so the objective world, the world around us, the creation, is real. The subjective one is one to be found. We're going to find the subjective world, find my consciousness. And they would say, but here's something, though, to think about. The reason they say we are self-conscious and self-determinate, in other words, I have self-conscious, self-awareness, I can self-determine, is past finding out. In other words, the knowledge too attainable for us. They are, however, just given facts that we work from. In other words, we know we have consciousness, we know we have self-determination. When those things just already are. And through self-consciousness, we begin to find self-consciousness, self-determination. Where those things actually come from, even though we kind of find those things, how they got their existence, self-consciousness, self-determination, is something we don't know. It's just a fact of life. I would say we do know where that comes from. God gave us the ability to know. God gave us a consciousness. God gave us the ability to understand and to know. And one author wrote, "If God does not exist, there is at least one being in whom existence precedes essence, a being who exists before he can be defined by any concept, and this being is man." And so they're saying there's this man existing, and he finds his existence. He's existing here, and he begins to develop self-consciousness. He begins to find life. He begins to exist when he becomes self-aware or finds himself. And so to kind of understand this two-world concept, this two-being concept, salt is salt, trees are trees, and the only thing in the world that came into the world not bearing its nature, in other words, is not the same all around, was human beings. Human beings are not human beings until they make themselves so. So I'm just a material matter walking around robotically, and I become a human being by finding myself. And it's a very false notion, obviously. But one other author wrote, "At first man is nothing. Only afterwards will he be something, and he himself will have made him what he will be." So I guess, is that helping you all understand, get the idea? I'm making myself something. I'm going to make myself to be, to exist. And so any questions or any thoughts you want to have up to this point, Brother Doug?
Yeah, this goes towards designing morality, but years ago I did a book report, years ago, on Atheistic Existentialism, and the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre made a statement that I've never forgotten. He said, you could be driving through some street, see an elderly lady crossing the road, and said there's three equal moral choices. You could stop, allow her to cross, stop, help her cross, or run her over. And they were all equal choices.
Right, and we'll get to there in a moment, but that's where I discover what's good. I find myself, I find good, and so then it's subjective to however I feel. We'll get to that because that you're very exactly on. That gets to the point where, well, anything goes. So Hitler killing 6 million Jews, why should the United States go over and prevent him from doing that, prevent him from conquering other nations? It's just a choice of his. He's finding himself and killing other people. And so that's where this false view comes in. And I understand the gentleman you just mentioned, John Sartre.
Jean-Paul Sartre.
Sartre. So I was reading about him. He's I think I took a quote from him a second ago. But apparently at the end of his life, I think he became Christian. Now that's subjective too. He was under a Catholic influence. So he kind of came to the conclusion that there was a God, that there is God, God is real and all that, and that there's just no way that this belief could possibly be. And I think part of that was through the morality issue is partly what brought him to an understanding of God. I'm not sure that he was saved. I do not know the full extent of that. But so anyways, that's pretty much this idea of finding yourself, atheistic existentialism. And I would say partly on well, not partly, I would say firmly on this thought that we are made in the image of God. The Bible's very clear about that. We are what God created us to be. And even though there's a sense in which we can self-determine some things. So we can determine, you might hear the phrase, you determine your own destiny. And there is, I understand, some aspect in that thought maybe. We need to be careful how we throw that phrase around. But there is some aspect in that if you have a certain outlook on life, your life is going to be, like if you have a miserable outlook on life, your life is probably going to be miserable. That's just the way God has created us. But at the same time, and so people would say, well, you create your own reality. You create a miserable reality. Well, I would say, I don't know if you might say that's a reality as much as you create your own atmosphere, maybe is a better word, or your own conditions of living. You can live, out on the street if you want to, or you can live in a house. That's your choice. You have the ability to make that choice in most cases. And the same with life. You have the ability to be happy, to choose joy, choose Jesus, or you can choose the world and choose sadness and miserableness and so forth. So I get that sense in which you can choose, perhaps some people use the phrase, you can choose your own destiny. But I do not agree, obviously, with this belief where you choose who you are. You become, you can choose how you are, how you're being. And that is certainly a false notion. God created all men in his own image. We've looked at that verse several times, but so I'm not going to turn to now, but we are created in the image of God. I think we have an understanding of that doctrine, that concept. And We can determine whether we will be lazy or diligent beings. We can determine whether we'll be hateful or kind beings, and so forth. But those things are not rooted within ourselves. They're rooted in the nature of God. They're either rooted in God, or those things are rooted in our fallen selves, in fallen nature, in sin. And so who I am is rooted in either God or rooted in self and sin. And that's simply the teaching of the Scriptures. Now, some of these beliefs of self-determination and freedom, considering the human being, how about freedom? If we obviously have the ability to find ourselves, we must have some self-freedom, some self-determination, which we would both agree. We as believers believe we have self-determination. We can determine most things in life. Now, there are certain things I couldn't determine where I was born. I had no choice in that. I was born in Clinton, Maryland. There's nothing I could do to prevent that from happening. So I couldn't self-determine that way, but there are some things I self-determined to be here this morning. I had this choice in the matter. And so there are many things that we are self-determining in. Pretty much, for the most part, we are self-determining individuals. But humans are totally free. Each of us is, they would say, uncoerced, but here's their belief, not under any outside transcendent influence. And I would say to the contrary, no, we are under the influence of an outside being. Even though we are totally free under God, we still have the influence of God on our lives. And God has ordained certain things. For instance, God has ordained laws. And even though men violate those laws, and we see the entrance of sin, and sometimes men are not always held by those laws, but God ordained that, if you murder someone, you're going to be held accountable for that. We're under the influence of God in that aspect. But they would say we're totally free. We're not under the influence of any transcendent being. And we are capable of doing anything imaginable within our subjectivity. So anything our mind can imagine, come up with, we are capable of doing. I would challenge that. Again, you come to the 1930s, and with the discovery of the cars and so many inventions coming about, many people at that believed we were going to create a utopia. We're going to create this great world. Anything was possible. You just had to imagine it and do it. And you find that in some of the movies back then and so forth. Obviously, World War II came after the 1930s and proved that wrong. Showed men this world is not a utopia and that men are wicked. And morality comes in this aspect. But we would not say we're capable of doing anything. We're capable of doing things contained in the laws of God. God set established laws, and anything outside of that is sin. But they would also say the objective world, this matter world, the existence around us, is isolated and controlled. The subjective is not. So in other words, this world is controlled by laws. It's controlled by certain things. For instance, gravity. Gravity controls a lot of things in this world. An apple falls off the tree, it's going to go down. The world is controlled by laws, and that's the objective world controlled by laws. The subjective world, my consciousness, my understanding, my awareness, is not controlled. And I can determine and have a free will in that aspect. I don't have a free will in this aspect. I can't change the laws of nature. Now, I would say that maybe has changed. They have created, you go and they prepare astronauts for space, and they remove gravity and all that kind of crazy stuff. It's kind of fun, but for the most part, we would say the world is subject to the laws, whereas man's mind and consciousness is not subject to those. And so they would say, hey, if I wanted to, my mind, and here's where they say there's these two meet together and are against each other, and that in the real world, in the objective world, if I step off a building, a 10-story building, step out a window, I'm going to fall. But in my imaginary mind, I can step out in the building, I'm not going to fall. We'll get to that in a moment. But that's where some of the craziness, I think, enters. But we are free within, they would say, yet subject to the laws and limitations without. We then create our own values by affirming worth. And I'm kind of jumping ahead onto values, but value is in the inner being, and that inner being is each being's own. And so value is created by me. And the world is isolated under laws, but I create my own laws, I create my own values, I create my own purposes. Subjective world is what they would call it, is that of knowledge, values, decisions, and acts whose purpose is of our own goal-seeking behavior. In other words, I find my values, I find what is valuable, I find worth. We create our own values, and a value is the inner being, this subjective being, and each we create our own. And now continuing on the thought of natural law and order, the objective world has orders and laws, gravity, the digestive system, they would say, because that's material matter. It's not immaterial matter, they would say, that is subject to certain laws. It's just there. Their term is there-ness. So if you're reading along, someone will use the phrase there-ness. They just mean it simply exists. Never had a beginning. There's nothing causing it. It's just the regular process of nature. It's just there. And so they would call that there-ness. The subjective world, however, knows no order. We make ourselves to be by fashioning our subjectivity. And of course, they would continue, your subjective world does not fit the objective world. Here's where they butt up against each other. They smack up against each other. And so you might think of stepping off a 10-story building, but it does not match up with the objective world, my conscious world, where gravity still demands, or excuse me, I got that backwards. You may think subjective of stepping off a 10-story building, but that does not match up with the objective world in which gravity will demand that we fall. And so there's some inconsistencies in their beliefs. They would say, and here's a phrase they pull from the Bible, we are strangers in a foreign land. I think that is probably pulled out of the book of Hebrews. But they would say the world is absurd and does not fit us. Well, that runs contrary to the Bible. They would say because I can't step off a 10-story building and because I fall, the world just doesn't really fit with human beings. But we would say no, God did create the world to be inhabited by man. He created it in a perfect way, created it good. The Bible's very clear on that. In fact, Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 clearly tells us that God gave man dominion over it when he created man. Genesis 1 and down verse 26, God said, let us make man in our own image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. So God created man in his own image. I won't continue reading, but simply put, God created us to live in this world. It's not contrary to us. We're able to live. This world was created for us. And obviously, I know that it was created for God too. The Bible tells us, I think it's Colossians, that these things were created for his pleasure. And they are and were created for his pleasure. But also God created it for us to enjoy. All things richly for us to enjoy. 1 Timothy tells us, I think it's chapter 5 or 6 there. But one author wrote, we must ever live in the face of the absurd. We must not forget our bent toward non-existence, but live out the tension between love of life and certainty of death. We must ever live in the face of the absurd. In other words, our consciousness in this finding self-existence world is contrary to the world in which our physical, objective world is. And one thought, and I'm kind of interjecting this on the thought of self-determining and all that, but they would say concerning death, that when we die, we just simply become an object among other objects. We don't really have this eternal existence because we're just matter. So our consciousness, our self-awareness ceases to exist, and we just become an object among other objects. But going back to the thought, nothing is of value in the objective world. So this matter world, this created world, is of no matter. But while we are conscious, we create value. So nothing is of value in the objective world, but through our consciousness, through finding myself, we create value. One author wrote, the meaning of man's life consists in proving to himself every minute that he is a man and not a piano key. And so you see kind of their beliefs there. Proving I'm living to find myself, living to say that I am actually real and not some subject matter. I'm not this microphone. I am actually existing. And I don't have to live my life proving that. I don't have to live my life trying to find that, pursuing an endless horizon. No, I know that as a matter of fact. I know that I'm here and real because the Bible tells me, because God is real, and so forth. Now, moving on, as Brother Doug mentioned before, morality and ethics, they would say understanding. Before I jump there, I should pause and ask anybody have any questions so far. Are you confused as I am? I have to say, they use a lot of terms that are hard to understand, for instance, subjectivity and objectivity. To me, objectivity is there's objective to it. There's a purpose to it. And subjectivity is it's subjective to something. But obviously their beliefs, the way they use these words is different. And so forth. And you find there-ness. Well, I would say, yes, the chair is there. But they would say, no, that means that it's always been there. And so there's a lot of these phrases that you have to work around. So any questions so far? Any way I can help you better understand? All right, I think we'll move on then. Any other thoughts? All right. So concerning morality or ethics, to them, understanding what is good is simply a conscious chosen act. So to know what is good, I don't go to the Bible. It's just a conscious act. I'm finding good. conscious chosen action. Good is whatever a person chooses. The good is part of subjectivity. It is not measured outside the individual human dimension. So in other words, outside of my consciousness and my awareness, I don't find good. In other words, I can't find good in God. God is not good. I can't find good in creation. And I realize we need to be careful with that, but I can see the goodness of God, probably is a better way to put it, in creation. God created certain things, and they are good and for my benefit. But they would say goodness is something pursued, found in my coming to myself, my finding existence. One author wrote, "To choose to be this or that is to affirm at the same time the value of what we choose. Because we can never choose evil, we always choose good." Doesn't that sound false? We always choose. Did Hitler choose good? Did the terrorists who bombed the 2001 bomb the Twin Towers, did they choose good? No, obviously not. The Bible clearly tells us, for all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. There is a standard by which we define things, and even though people may reject God, they in the back of their minds, we might say, know that there is a standard for morality. It's all across the board. I do not create good. They would say certain things are right or wrong, and it's just all across the board. But according to this belief, then, it establishes as many standards of value as there are people in the world. So if I determine good and you determine good, well, in this room here, there's probably 30 different opinions about what good is then, according to their belief. And so there's no one standard. It's all across the board. And then you run into a problem. Well, if I believe it's good to kill you and you believe it's not good to kill me, I might come and kill you. I'm not trying to be sadistic or anything here, but you result in that kind of thinking. But they may counter this, though, by saying that, well, when we meet each other, we encounter a recognizable center of subjectivity. You say, well, what does that mean? Basically, when I see you or meet you, we all have this kind of common good understanding of what good is. And so it's just something inherent in us. So we just kind of all know. Well, that's not the case. So there's many people out there that have different opinions about what good is and what good is not. And but they would continue on saying, we are able to see that others are making a meaning for themselves. By making a meaning, they mean good. They're making value for themselves. And thus we are in this together in such a way that nothing can be good for us without being good for all. That doesn't make sense. So even though my definition of good might be different than yours, it's good for everyone. So Hitler's choice to massacre 6 million Jews was good for us all. Well, that's his thinking behind that. What's good for the world? We need to purge them from this world. And so you can see how all these false beliefs come to shake out to. And then we would ask the question, does good have any meaning then? Is there such a thing as good? Because good is subjective to all of us. There's no set establishment of what good is. And while they might say, yes, we all kind of recognize good, we just somehow inherently recognize it, what is the meaning of it then? And they say evil is not choosing. Evil is not in choosing. Good is in choosing. Any action passionately chosen is good. And so evil is not really an act of choosing. Good is an act of choosing. Evil is something that is part of this world, part of the objective world is their belief. Evil is failing to recognize, they would say, the absurdity of the world. It is passivity, living after the direction of others, not recognizing the absurdity of this world. And so good is choosing, good is discovering, good is pursuing existence. Evil is living passively, living under the influence of a religion and so forth. And so you see how they determine evil and good. Well, good is any action I'm passionate about. Well, you can be passionate about the wrong thing. You can be passionate in evil. Why do we have police officers then? If good is found in choosing, they're trying to find themselves in robbing a bank. No, there is a standard for right or wrong, and we know that there is. And the only way that can be all across the board is because there's a God who established that fact. And so there's an inability in this belief to distinguish moral from immoral, because anything ultimately goes. And of course, the ultimate goal in all this, in all of atheistic existentialism, is to find meaning and good by transcending this world, transcending matter, and finding yourself in some knowledge, action, or value. I'm going to discover myself. I'm going to create my existence, create my being in my head. In other words, my being is a thought, something I think about, something I perceive, my awareness, and I'm creating that. And of course, it's a false notion. God created us. The Bible tells us on the sixth day, God created us in his image. We do, or rather we are, under an outside influence, under the influence of God. God has created established laws, not just in life, not just in this world. The world follows certain laws, such as gravity and so forth, but also as human beings, there are inherent laws that are within us, laws of morality and so forth. That is very clear. We read that last week even in Romans, how God created us with that, within ourselves. God gave us a consciousness to know.
That different standards for police officers, CIA, and people like that? And who set those standards? Does God have different standards for those people that protect the country?
No, God has a standard all across the board. God's standards are all the same. His standard does not change. So when God says this is wrong, it doesn't make it right for you or I. Now, so here's one instance.
Is that a sin?
What's that?
Is that a sin?
To have a different standard for one, not the other. It is a sin, absolutely. Yes, sir. Yep. God's standard is all across the board. When God says something is wrong, that means it's wrong. Now, I have to say, there are some things. For instance, it's wrong for me to speed up and down the highway because the Bible has ordained government. Government says, out here it's 55 miles per hour. I'm to keep within that to keep folks safe. And to violate that would be breaking the law. However, a police officer responds to emergency. He's going to be doing over 55. He's not breaking the law because that law is, in that case, subjective to the situation. That situation allows for him, the police officer, to speed in that case to help or aid another. But again, the standard, ultimate standard, is set by God. Do you understand a little bit there? Brother Doug.
I just wanted to, in the Bible it says, beware of those who call good evil and evil good. So clearly God is, as we would understand, has already determined what is good and what is evil. And we assign
Right.
good and evil.
God has ordained for us to have dominion over the world, so he's given us the power to establish laws and to disobey those laws under his given commands to establish government and so forth. Be wrong. Now, if a police officer's out here speeding and they say, oh, because he's a police officer, we're going to let him go, he don't have to get a ticket, but because you're not a police officer, you have to get a ticket, that would be wrong. That would not be obeying God's standard. So I'm trying to think of some ways to explain that to you. Does that help at all?
I was just wondering what these people are God's president and things like that. CIA and things like that. Not speeding or something like that. I mean, that's recognizable.
Right.
These Secret Service people, things like that. People work for the CIA and all. They do covert operations and things like that.
Right.
Are they?
Some of the things they do are right, and then there are things they do that are wrong. But of course, there's been instances, in fact, I think I was reading one of this week, where there's a couple of CIA officers who had been caught with molesting children and so forth, and they did not end up going to jail. They were let go. They were just relieved from duty. But that's not right. If another individual over here should go to jail, then why shouldn't they? So that would be a situation where they're not doing right. They're not keeping God's standard across the board. Does that help you a little bit there? So they're protecting our country, and that's a God-given right as well, to protect ourselves, to protect our country. The government was established for that, to punish evil and to reward good. And so part of the CIA branch of our government is to protect President, protect the United States. And some of those covert operations are good, and sometimes they're not. But I'm not too familiar with those enough to know which ones are or not.
God would hold him responsible for that then, huh?
It would depend on the situation. If they did right, if they were protecting our country sincerely, then they wouldn't be held responsible for that. But if they were just doing it out of, I guess I don't know what a good case would be. If they're not protecting our country and they're just doing it for their own benefit, they're just going out murdering people, for instance, for money or for greed, that would be wrong. So that's not given to them. That right isn't given to them by God, to go out and murder people for greed or for lust or whatever. But to protect our country, they're protecting what God has ordained for them to do. So
sometimes they build up their own ego, thinking that they are the makers of the law.
right, sometimes they think they are God, and then they begin to replace God with themselves, and so that's where men fail, and that's why preachers mentioned from the pulpit a few weeks ago. We need to get started here. But, one world government would be good, except for men are sinners. And one day, we will have a one world government under Jesus Christ. But Jesus Christ is perfect, so he'll never do wrong. And he'll always judge and rule righteously. But here under men, it does not work well. Because why? Men fail, men sin. And that's all governments across the board. Does that help you out there?
Yeah, I won't take up no more.
Oh, you're good. We do need to finish because we got folks coming in the back. Any other quick questions as we close up? Anything you want to add, thoughts you want to add? All right, let's pray. Lord, we love you, and we're thankful for your word. Thank you for giving us understanding. Lord, we pray for clarity and for understanding where we do not. And Lord, give us good understanding, we pray. And be with us in the morning service. Help us to worship you and honor you with all that we do and say this morning and throughout the rest of this day. We ask in your name. Amen. All right, I'll see you guys next week. Y'all take care. And if you have any questions, I'll be around.